All right, folks, welcome to Kubernetes SIG Apps for July 23rd, 2018. And I will share in the chat window. Today's meeting minutes and agenda are at that location. So the one quick announcement, I'll say, the Helm project, which has moved, which was under SIG Apps and moved to be a top-level CNCF project, the repos have now moved under the Helm org. So anybody who is looking for them under the Kubernetes org or in the Kubernetes-Helm org, they are now moved under the Helm org. No import paths or anything need to be messed with because all the forwarding and redirects are in place to make that possible. Today, we did not have a demo lined up. We do have some coming for future sessions, but we didn't have one for today. And so with that, we have, looks like a single discussion topic and then open discussion afterwards. And so if there's something y'all would like to talk about, please feel free to add it to the discussion here. And with that, Josh, was that you who added the chart repo management UI, ChartMuseum, which has to do with Helm conversation?
Yeah, I just added that to the doc.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so here. Basically, for those of you on the call who are not familiar, ChartMuseum is a way to, it's a project for hosting your own Helm chart repository. So it's kind of become part of the Helm project. It's in the Helm GitHub org, and a number of people have been asking me if there's a UI for this, and this is not to be confused with the Monocular project, which is what CubeApps is based on, or CubeApps Hub is based on. This would be about hosting your own chart repo, and then Monocular is more about discovering charts across multiple chart repos. So I put a link in the doc. There's basically a list of requirements I put on, but more or less it's the ability to list all the charts in your repo, download them, upload them, and delete them all through a UI. And then there's some other desired functionality, but the ChartMuseum project is not mature enough to handle some of the use cases. So if you're interested in kind of having a user interface for managing your own chart repo based on ChartMuseum, please comment on this issue. And as well as if you're interested in developing it, I'm not sure that I myself could actually put a lot of time into this, and I'm not the most up-to-date on the newest and latest and greatest JavaScript stuff, so any help is appreciated. That's pretty much all I got. If there's any questions, let me know.
It sounds like silence is acceptance. And if there's anybody who's interested in contributing to this, please speak up. You can always grab in a side channel, or you can try and twist somebody's arm or talk them into coming and helping contribute to it. Please go ahead. All right. So with that, because we really don't have much else going on in the coming weeks, we're going to have a bunch more stuff. We can now have open discussion. Is there anything anyone wanted to talk about?
I'd like to bring something up regarding the icons PR that was recently merged in.
The icons PR?
Yes.
Can you share a link to it for everyone?
Yeah, one moment. It was number 17. Yeah.
Into the applications project?
Yeah, into the applications project, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, so we were actually talking about that a bit at Red Hat prior to it merging. There was a concern from some of the teams regarding having the icons explicitly reference something that is online, and then we'd like to have the ability to support essentially loading those icons offline for clusters that are air-gapped. So I'm currently working on a PR to extend that, where you will be able to define the icon inline, either as binary or as text if you have SVG. Also working on being able to reference a config map if you say have a very large image, or you have a very large SVG that you don't want to be there in the app CRD manifest. So that should be done, and hopefully today or sometime this week, I'll have that up to share with you guys.
Perfect. One thing I'd like to say.
Question on that, real quick.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, will that support data URLs?
The current incarnation is specifically says data URLs, which are defined in RFC 2397. That's actually
so that's
noted.
already there.
That's already there. So data URLs are already supported. The one problem you'll run into is that etcd, this is all stored in etcd, which has upper limits on size. And that means, right, if your image is too big as a data URL, you're going to run into size bits.
Oh, we talked about that before. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
no, as far as offline, you know, because lots of folks are going to want to proxy that image. You know, I always think of the way that GitHub does stuff. If you embed a link to an image, if I remember right, they've got a domain like GitHub user content, something like that, where they will actually run it through and then they serve it after making sure that it's not something nefarious. There are situations where you'd want to do something like that. The question, and we can hash it out there, is should that be part of the spec or an implementation detail for folks behind it who maybe do pre-processing on the spec before it goes into a cluster? I don't know the answer to it, but that is one of the things that we had talked about before, is where does this live? Something like this, when you have that situation like a GitHub, or I imagine Google Cloud, if they were going to use this, or any of the other clouds, and they were going to use those icons, they're going to store it locally, cache it locally so it goes faster, not reach out over the web and trust the URL doesn't go away. You know, make sure it's secure and somebody's not embedding something nefarious in it. Stuff, you know, there's lots of reasons to do it. Where is that right, you know, extension point? And that's something definitely worth talking about. Another thing to the image spec that we'll probably end up bringing in, and we were discussing, is in, this was based on the web app spec, and they have a purpose field for the purpose for an image, rather than just, you know, size information and type. They have a purpose, and we have been talking about bringing that in because there might be a difference between an icon versus a banner versus something else. And we might look at introducing that idea as well. Just so as you're thinking about this, that's another concept.
Sure.
I think is a PR.
Yeah, just so you guys have some reference, a lot of this came out of items and discussion points with the operator Lifecycle Manager, which I don't know, I'll see if I can get a link into the chat here. But that's something that a lot of folks are, Red Hat are currently working on as well, to essentially bring, part of that is bringing essentially a catalog of operators to your cluster, which are then managed by the operator lifecycle manager. So,
okay.
Yeah, so right now their catalog concept, I believe that is currently in this repo, but my understanding is the long-term vision of that is that might exist outside. Either as a separate GitHub repo or a separate site altogether.
Okay, that makes sense. No, it makes sense. The only thing I would say is that for the data standpoint, we looked at a couple of them and we went with data URLs. In addition to regular URLs to store the data. If you think there's something else beyond that that would be useful, I'd love to know the reasoning behind it. whatever it might be. I understand that, you know, this does end up usually being base 64 encoded, which is a larger data set than just the image in other formats. But
so the config maps, one of the main advantages there is reuse and sharing. So if you've got multiple applications trying to reference an icon, you don't have to have it in every application's CRD.
mm-hmm.
Quick question. This is just a random idea that popped into my head. What about Git URLs?
So you mean for a revisioning Git, or you mean like Git : //
Yeah, exactly. Like if you need to store arbitrary data somewhere, a lot of organizations have their own Git repos and they use them for air gap purposes. You know, anything they need to store gets pulled down and put into their Git repo. So that could potentially be a way to bridge that air gap as well.
It could. It doesn't let the whole idea of dynamic caches be involved. Yeah, and there's a number of ways we could look at this, right? Like if it's a URL structure, do you do something like config map : / the name of it, something like that, or just some other defined URL that works for this, where you can key off of that first part of the URL to know what to do with it. There's things like that we could do, because when I look at Git : / I probably more want HTTPS, but you know, and some of this is even going to have to do with how do you reference it to view it, right? Am I pulling it in and proxying it through to view it, and that's just my origin source? Because with the config map and somebody viewing it in a browser somewhere like me at home versus some other place, how does that config map get turned into a URL that can now be sent through the browser? There's a lot of implementation details that are built on top of whatever this data storage model is, right?
Well, further question on that then, since you mentioned it, is there a standard URL scheme for referring to cluster resources like config maps?
I think all of this, it's all going to be fronted by tooling, right? There's some sort of tooling that's going to be looking through your application instances and deciding how to render them. So the tooling becomes responsible for deciding whether it's going to resolve the config map reference or render the data URI or pass through the URI, or how that's going to be handled. There's another layer here that comes into play before the end user is just looking at that and trying to figure out how to resolve a reference to a config map or something else.
Well, I'm just wondering if the Kubernetes project has an idea of like a standard URL format scheme for referring to cluster resources, because that seems like the kind of thing that eventually lots of projects are going to need, and it makes more sense for them to define it than for everybody to define their own.
So, I mean, the standard today is that you do an object reference, right?
Mm-hmm. Is that documented anywhere? I assume it must be.
I mean, there's just lots of API objects that have object references. I don't know if there's a formal documentation about it.
Joe, that sounds like a lovely contribution.
The penalty for a good idea is implementing it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and so some of this is how much should be in these specs and in these trucks, and that's kind of where, I think it's a great point that whoever is going to display it, whatever tooling that uses this, is going to be responsible for figuring it out. If it's a data URI, if it's a URL, and maybe that, just for example, you've got a caching system, right? And it sees this data URL and it says, okay, what's my local cache URL in some kind of lookup? And it looks it up and it gets it, and that's what it sends to the user. Or maybe it says, oh, I don't have this one. I need to go out and fetch it and make sure it's in good shape. And there's things like that that can be done as well, which is all tooling on top of it. And so this is, when the pull request comes in, this is one of those things we'll probably poke at, is to say what should be in here versus what's the responsibility of tooling on top of it. because so part of our so one of the things we had with all of this, and please, this was our thinking, so feedback on it is always welcome, was to make this as light as possible so it conveyed enough information to enable implementers on top. We don't want to go too over the top in what's defined so that it infringes on the implementation details. We want to give the implementers enough that they can go do what they need to do, more than try to force an implementation, right? Because that's a Kubernetes thing here. We want to be more platform in this aspect and enable the ecosystem. And so how much of this is worth being in the spec versus being up to implementers to do all kinds of wonderful things with? All right, so I've blabbered on too much about that. Did anybody else have any other thoughts on it? All right. Thank you for bringing that up. I look forward to any pull requests on this because we want to see the application repo keep moving.
Looking forward to it.
Feedback. Yeah. Were there any other open discussion topics folks wanted to discuss today?
Guess if nobody else has got anything, I just wanted to wave hello virtually to Ryan J over there.
All right, folks. Well, with that in mind, if there's nothing else today, we'll give you a bunch of time back and have a wonderful week. We'll see you online. There's some nice conferences going on. I hope some folks are enjoying those or get a chance just to stream anything that's streaming. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week.
See you next time.